Okay, welcome everybody back. John, are we doing any introductions in this one, or are we just going to be continuing?
No, I think we'll just continue, Barry. I think we might have quite a few people from the previous one. So, yeah, over to you.
Good, as everybody comes back with it. All right, so thanks everybody for coming to this session. Same thing before. I posted the links into the slides we're going to be using here. I also posted the link to one of the guides, and I'll explain the reasons behind the guides when we get to that in there. At any time, ask questions. So if you got something as I'm speaking, ask the question. John will jump in and say, "Yo, Barry, we got a question." So feel free to interrupt. I got some questions from past times I've done this session, and I'll give some context around it. So let me go ahead and get the slides up here shared. Oops, that button. There we go. Yeah. The video up there, and there we go with it. So in this section here, the session I did before this, which is understanding the miscreant principles, right, and using kind of like behavioral principles as part of your DOS resiliency work, and what fended off attacks, because you got to remember, people launch attacks against, people are behind the attacks. They write the malware, they do the botnets, they do the distributions, they launch all that. So you got to remember your enemy are different people in different parts of the world. So here in this session, there'll be a few slides that will be overlapping here, but since I'll briefly go through some of the context. Everybody has an understanding of context, because it gives a premise of where I'm coming from, being doing this for quite a while. And in this session here, we're going to be focusing primarily on DNS infrastructure. And DNS infrastructure, I don't have it in this presentation, but there's always a funny one. And I'll put it into the links on the final version we put up there. But one of the funniest DNS videos I ever saw was done by the JP Nick crew, the ones who take care of the .jp domain. And you can find this commercial, this video on YouTube, and they were doing a commercial trying to explain what DNS is. And they had this guy going around Tokyo trying to explain what they do in DNS. And every time the guy talked and tried to explain it, the person fell asleep. He's talking to somebody on the train, they fall asleep. They talk to somebody at a park bench, they fall asleep. They talk, everywhere. It's like the whole series of it. He was talking about DNS and they fall asleep, right? It's just so boring. And then finally they had this person who could never sleep, is totally insomniac, and they came up and asked him, "Can you come and talk to them about DNS?" And this guy who can never sleep for years, laying on the bed, all of a sudden fell asleep, and then everybody around the bed fell asleep. And then they ended the commercial. That's DNS. It's so essential to everything we do, but yet everybody forgets about it. And they forget about the wrong times. And the bad guys, they know all about it and they whack it. And that's what this session's all about, is not to get people to forget about this critical infrastructure. So we're gonna look, understand what the miscreants kind of know. And we saw that with these DDoS extortion attacks going on, and like the new wave, because we got one wave of DDoS extortion attacks that peaked up, and it's in the long tail. It's still going on, so you still can get hit. They come back around. But now we got another tail, another cycle starting up, where we're seeing these ransomware crews starting to use DOS attacks. And they will go out there. They'll do the intelligence, right? They're not like idiot, criminals out there. They'll do the intelligence, and if they see that you've neglected, you've done what most organizations do, they neglect their DNS authoritative infrastructure, they'll whack you. Right, and then all of a sudden you go like, well, okay, why'd that happen, right? And there's really, key things. It's so easy to actually get your DOS infrastructure up to speed where it's resistant to attack these days. It's not like the old days where you had to do all sorts of special things and deploy servers all over the place. I mean, it's affordable and easy for most organizations to do it. So let's kind of dive in and understand our miscreant threat. Now, I covered this in past sessions. This is kind of reinforcement. You know, number one, the miscreants want to go after your network, they'll get after your network. I mean, this example is an example from the Sony Pictures break-in the FBI's talking about, and now we've got this big wave of investigations going on with the SolarWinds, a wave of attacks. And as people dig into it, they're finding more and more things with it. You know, people want to get into your networks, just assume they're going to get in. An extra tidbit I didn't mention in the last session, you just take like an Akamai years ago, we got so frustrated whacking, you know, as people trying to break into the network, that we started going down a model which is now called Beyond Trust and Zero Trust, or the Beyond Corp and Zero Trust, depending on how you name it. But it's basically an environment where you don't trust anything. And people think that's a new concept. It's actually not a new concept. I first learned that concept back in 1988. Let's say again, Zero Trust and Beyond Corp is not new. It's a concept that goes back to 1988 when the US Defense Department Rainbow Book series came out. And in the Rainbow Book series, it actually laid out, here's an environment where you don't trust anything within a network realm. And the first time, over the years, this has been tried over and over again, where you assume you're going to get broken into. It's a whole model where you assume you're going to get broken into, and that's the sort of thing you have to think about when you do this. And we're going to be talking through this on there as we talk each section in the DNS part with this concept. Don't trust anything, you know, set up the verification in there and the techniques around it, right? We're seeing increases in DDoS attacks. This is last year, 2019 statistics. That was an article, but it increased last year because DNS was part of the extortion attack. So when IDC comes out with a 2020 figure set, you know, it will be out there. The key thing around this with DNS, as we'll talk about, is it's a critical dependency. It's critical to everything, right? So there's so many things linked to it that if you know where to poke, you can have a much with a smaller amount of force, you can have a much bigger impact on the services and the resiliency and infrastructure. So that's one of the things that you just don't want to ignore. This is a problem that's not going to go away because, you know, Barry's mantra, we don't have a cybersecurity problem. Cybersecurity is a collateral impact because we don't have international justice. You know, how are we going to go out there and do it? And the international justice system is, you know, 100 years away. So anybody here who's looking for gainful employment, you know, protecting against all the different threat vectors is, you know, it's going to be around with us for quite a while until we solve that problem. The other problem to focus on is you know, machine guns don't fire themselves. Botnets don't fire themselves. Botnets are not created by themselves. Malware is not created by themselves. DOS attacks don't have them by themselves. It's all about the people. There are people out there doing this. Your enemy is not the reflector. Your enemy is the person who is launching a spoofed flow into the reflector and hitting you with a UDP flood on port 53. That's your enemy. You know, and you know, think of that over and over again. It's not the AK-47 that robbed the bank. It is the person who robbed the bank, right? So, and you know, one of the things I put on a note on here, as the internet has all come together. You know, I remember when people, you know, the days were, what's the internet? What's the internet? Nobody knew. Now it's like, you know, our lives lived, you know, all this during this COVID period. Thank goodness everything kind of converged together. But think of this, you know, how would the world survive if we didn't have, you know, COVID? The internet is critical. It's critical infrastructure, right? We wouldn't have been able to do the vaccines that we did if we didn't have that infrastructure protected, right? And there was two big task force to protect, you know, those institutions who are doing all the research and doing all the COVID work in different parts of the world. These different trust group task force that spun up to protect it, knowing that they need to actually put an intimidation against the people who are launching the attacks or want to do ransomware, who wanted to do break-ins and things like that, because this is now life impacting. Right? What we do now isn't just for people to play games, it's life impacting, right? So this is a serious sort of issue. Our threat vectors, as I mentioned before, cybercrime, easy to understand. Everybody talks about it all the time. Nation states, it's in the news. It's never gone away. Nation states are always there. My first DOS attack in '91 was a nation state attack. One nation state attacking another nation state. So you have these things out there all the time with it, right? So then you have the political patriotic protesters out there, the people who are like, they're expressing their voices, they're expressing their concerns. In Asia Pacific, you'll get periodic phases of it, like people around the world protesting against whaling activity in Japan, as an example. There'll be political motivations across with it. So this happens. Watch it. Let's see. Greg just mentioned, Barry, your screen isn't full screen. Is it meant to me? Let me just stop sharing real quick, and then I'll share it again. Yeah. Nope. Let me do that again. Share screen. Pick that one. Hold on for a minute. Let me just. Do that. And here, let's try this sharing again. There we go. Okay. So hopefully that's a bit better on the, it's in presentation mode.
That looks much better.
That much better? Okay, good. Thank you. All right, good. All right, so I added in presentation mode. There are technical things going on. So corporate threats. Corporate threats are, you see in my times, because Singapore is second home for me, so I'm in Asia quite often. But in Asia, we have these corporate threats. You have company A, company B. There isn't really things stopping them from hiring people who do security espionage for each other, right? And so we see these. We started seeing these in the North America. I was alerted to the increased activity back during the pipeline protest that happened a few years ago in South Dakota. And we're seeing corporations hiring people out of India to actually spy on people in South Dakota, and all the people, protesters that came from around the world to protest that. So it's these are the different categorizations I use with it. Other people use other categorizations with it. All this kind of goes together. We just call this as a force of nature. So when it related to DNS infrastructure, it's not if you're going to get attacked, it's when you're going to get attacked. You're going to get hit with something. People are going to poke at it. And we see this all the time. We can't, like, I work at Akamai right now, and on our authoritative infrastructures is really funny, because you'll see precursors. You'll see before they hit a web property, you'll see them poke at DNS. You'll see this big spike, and these spikes happen periodically over time. So you look at it in a 1 month period, and you see a particular customer, and they'll get 4 or 5 of them a month. And sometimes, we'll talk to them and they don't even realize they're being poked at, they're hit. When new customers come online, they won't even realize this is out there, right? Because they'll poke at it, and then they'll have a consequence on their customers, and they won't see it until it's too late, right? So this is something I kind of mentioned in detail on DOS attacks out there. But this session here, those who didn't hear my last session, over the years, we kind of 20 years ago, there's Rob Thomas and I came up with the 7 habits of highly effective cyber criminals, where we say, don't get caught, don't work too hard, follow the money. You don't do anything unless you can make money off of it. If you can't take out the target, move the attack to a couple dependency. DNS is a couple dependency. So somebody's web property is so robust that you can't take it out, shift over to authoritative DNS, right? It's one little firewall with 2 servers behind it, and I take it out, and it's much easier to take that out with a megabit per second attack versus a multiple gigabits attacks against a web property, right? So that's an example of a couple dependency. Always do things cross jurisdictional. That means I don't use resources in one country of that where I live in. So in other words, if I live in country X, I'll use resources that are in country Y and Z, right? So that way, if somebody captures the malware or the spoofer or the stressor in country Y, they have to actually take that evidence and move it across the border, right? And then look for targets who don't prosecute. This is one of the things we're really trying to change, get lots of people to report to the police, right? And different DOS attacks, because it kind of focuses on this. It's a deterrent. You know, when you work with the police, criminals go away. They go away because they don't want to get caught. They don't want to work too hard. So they'll move away. Now, that may sound bad to say, okay, don't attack me, attack somebody else. But if everybody's doing this, this is how us as a society starts pushing back on it. All right. And then stay below the pain threshold, right? In other words, if you'll get, like, for instance, I've seen DOS attacks against DNS, authoritative DNS, where it was a trickle. It was a constant trickle against it was resource consumption. And then we'll get in there and we'll say, what's going on here? How come you have all this transactions going on, which are, you know, NX domain, NX domain, NX domain. I got this other NX domain junk going on. Okay, we trace it back and we find out it's a, you know, basically a low-level poking DOS consume resources sort of attack, you know, and you had to really look at it to find it. It was below the threshold. Now, how critical is DNS? So this is kind of like a breakdown with it. Like if you went and you looked up like Akamai.com, when you clicked and looked up Akamai.com on your computer, the first thing it's going to do is do a DNS lookup. And depending on where you're at in the world and the infrastructure you're using, that's going to go through a DNS resolver, and it's going to talk to, you know, in the worst case example, talk to the root, talk to the com, and talk to the authoritative, and you get a response back. That's not the whole thing though, because then you got the initial connection to the site because you get your A record or your quad A record, then you get your first byte, then you get your download, and then you got your page, and it's all renders. It all links together. So you notice in there that DNS and the response of DNS is a critical component. And there's two elements in there because we have two infrastructures here. There's the resolver infrastructure and there's the authoritative infrastructure. And a lot of times people just say, oh, DNS, it's one. So no, it's not one. There's a lot more DNS out there than you think, and a lot more different types of architectures as you think. So those of you who do any sort of architecture work, you got to realize how you build a resolver infrastructure robustly is different from how you build a authoritative infrastructure. And then as likewise, how you build a resolver infrastructure for people in an enterprise is different from how you build a resolver infrastructure for machines in a data center or virtual elements inside of a cloud operations, right? So even within each of these big buckets, resolver bucket, authoritative bucket, you have different things you're going to do. How you build an authoritative infrastructure for a cloud is going to be different from how you build an authoritative structure inside the cloud as you do on everything with containers and Kubernetes, right? And so this is kind of like the idea around this session to start to open your mind that there's a lot more DNS out there, and that the bad guys know a lot of what's going on out there, and they'll learn more because, again, just like I mentioned about that video, you know, and I'll make sure I'll get the link out of it, you know, from Japan. Everybody falls asleep when you start talking about DNS, but it's so critical to everything we do, all right? So in here, when you take, let's take a broadband environment. You take a broadband environment or a mobile environment, you know, you got your users and devices in the home. Like I got my home, I'm right now in Cupertino, California. I got my forwarder server in my Wi-Fi router. So, right, so going through this session here, I got my Wi-Fi router. There is a forwarder element in there. That is then talking to a DNS resolver infrastructure, and then that talks out to your root, your com, the authoritative, right? So you notice there's different elements in there that I can go after. I can go after the proxy server. I can go after the home proxy server, right? Which we see people, you know, organizations and miscreants have done that. They've gone in there and broken into proxies in major ISPs, and all the proxies, all the CPEs got violated, and they were turned into botnets, right? And so you get these things like the pseudo-random domain attacks, which are attacking the authoritative, who go through with violated proxies into the caching resolver, and then use that to attack the authoritative target, right? So, you know, all these it's not just one or the other. It's kind of like you got to understand, you know, be mindful of the risk for all of them. All right, so let's go through some of the basics. This is what a lot of the miscreants out there that we see, like the DOS extortionists, they kind of know these factors. They know what to go after and hit, all right, with it, all right? So the the miscreants, you know, they have a playbook, right? The smart ones. And the state actors really know, you know, the playbook with it. And we'll talk about it with the sea turtle attacks that happened in 2019, right? So they'll go out there and they know the target they want to DOS. They're going to collect the DNS intelligence of that target, right? Because they'll go out there and look it up and do that sort of stuff. They'll go, you know, they'll target. They have phishing as their tool. They can go after and target your administrative functions. They can do man in the middle. There's many different things that can happen out there from the miscreants playbook with it. So let's kind of talk through some of it. So here's a typical infrastructure, right? Typical infrastructure that's kind of like an enterprise where you have your some tool that you do on your zone file. If you're smart, you have DNSSEC, so you have a signer in there, and you have your primary, and then you push it out to different secondaries. If you're smart, many organizations, their primary is one of their front lines. They don't hide their primary. They don't hide it, so it's exposed. In other cases, I've seen the primary, the zone files, you know, hosters and the key infrastructure all exposed. So that's within your authoritative module. But that's not the only thing, because see, you have the administrators, and administrators have a pointer, because remember, we go from root, in this case, like the com, example.com, right? That example.com is off the registry, and the registry is getting the instructions from the registrar. And the registrar has the NS records, right? So these are all attack points, right? So a simple attack point that a bad guy to do is they say, oh, here's an organization and they have a couple of secondaries and they're sitting behind a firewall. I've seen huge organizations get taken out because they said, oh, I have redundant secondaries and firewalls protect my DNS and routers protect my DNS. Firewalls and DNS, you know, firewalls, you know, their job is to be a firewall. If you are under stress and they overload, what do? They shut down. That's their job. That's a firewall. That's what firewalls inside buildings are designed to do, to stop the spread of the attack, not to ride out the attack, all right? And so a bad guy would say, okay, let me throw a state level attack, overload the firewall, and force the firewall to do what a firewall is designed to do, contain. Make sure the attack doesn't spread in, which completes the DOS attack, all right? So the bad guys kind of know, they look for these sort of things where they go out there and say, oh, here's their infrastructure, here's the register they use, oh, here's what's going on with their secondaries. So they hit it from that, all right? You get these other things where they go out there and use customers to attack, right? So you get that first scenario, right? We see these other scenarios where, like I gave before, where the CPEs, because remember I mentioned about equipment not getting secure. A lot of times the CPEs inside the ISP are not secure. Or in today's world, that can be an IoT device. We have a team inside Akamai, and they're constantly looking at, like, oh, here's a CCTV device, and here's a thermostat. We're finding all these different devices that, as we trace back the different tools and reflectors used for DOS attacks, it's really amazing how much of these devices are getting violated by the bad guys, and they use them. And then they'll route them through, like in this particular case, a pseudo-random domain attack is to send a subdomain and forcing the authoritative to look up. You basically overload it with queries. So they're not hitting with a tremendous amount of packets per second. The bad guy knows the infrastructure isn't sized to take on query load. And so they'll hit you with a PRSD attack from different resolvers and broadband operators from around the world, and they overload you with queries. So now there's, you know, you got the query queue is so thick that you can't respond to legitimate people trying to get updates about your infrastructure, right? And then eventually you complete the DOS where people can't get to you, right? Then another example. So notice there's different angles here. We're pivoting around how bad guys, and these are all based off of real world attacks, right? So this is what the Sea Turtle attack wasn't the first one that did this sort of stuff, where you went after the the administrators and violated the accounts and then logged into the registrar. So CTurtle was where people went in after the administrative functions. Once they got into the administrative functions, what the bad guys would do is they would actually change the name servers around when people were asleep, right? Set up credentials on a certification authority, and then reset everything. And then when everybody woke up and was working, because they had the certification credentials that were official, because they rerouted a name server to make that happen, they would then go back in, change the name server around, send people through a man-in-the-middle attack, with valid credentials from the organization. And they basically were doing a big wiretap, man-in-the-middle, capturing a whole bunch of information, right? Variants of that attack have been going on for quite a number of years. CTurtle was one of them that popped up. It was kind of like a lot of people saw that as like, a big major one out there. And notice on that one isn't a DOS. That's going after people. It's people, the miscreants, attacking people, the administrators, and going after poor security on things like password control or some of the other things. And we'll be talking about that towards the end of the session about best practices that you can actually follow to mitigate those. The other thing that registrars and registries in ICANN, this is something that ICANN has really paid attention to, is there's a control infrastructure between the registrar and registry. And we see attacks poking at that infrastructure at times, right? And so this is something that, this is the realm of ICANN, the registrar certification, registry certification is something ICANN's looking at. So that linkage, right? That's a couple dependency you get between them, all right? So in a CTurtle attack, what they did here is they targeted the people and they created, in the middle of the night, set things up, and then they sent everybody to their primary server, and their primary server sent everybody to, this man-in-the-middle capture of everything, the pointers with it. So the idea about giving those few examples is to kind of get your mind around, DNS is an overlooked area. It's one of those things that's critical to everybody, and it's vital. A lot of times people just look at oh, it's reflectors, yeah, we have a lot of problems with DNS reflectors, but once, that's not the only form of attack vector you have to worry about with the authoritative or resolver DNS infrastructure. And, over and over again, it's, these different ways of attacks you can go after. It's not just one, it's poison attacks and collateral impact and the reflections, and you can penetrate and you can, shift the records around, right? So there's no simple aspect of saying, oh, I just turn on DNSSEC and it fixes things. As I'll explain it a bit, there are limitations to DNSSEC. You have to look at all the different elements of it, right? So one of the problems we have in the industry is organization will say, oh, I'll just have the sysadmin do the DNS work. And they give no resources and they have no budget, right? Until, the attack happens and people go like, what did that person do who was not funded and not given the resources, not doing stuff, right? That's the biggest risk we have in the DNS community and the internet, is that the person who's doing the DNS work is always underfunded, yet it's so freaking critical to it. And so some of the stuff that I've been doing is trying to increase the aspect of that. So let's talk through some of these vectors that are easy to do. And we'll talk more about this on credentials, right? So the credential part on the administrator, you got to be mindful that if you're one of these people who maintain DNS, you are a target. You have to do things to protect yourself because you are a target. How are you logging into the registrar? How are you setting up the password controls around that? Are you using two-factor authentication? Like if you're talking to any registrar out there, they need to really do two-factor authentication. That's one of the things to check on, because you are a target, right? You don't want to have somebody to all of a sudden use your password that you woke up and, wake up in the morning and you get a, have I been owned email, and the have I been owned shows your corporate account, and it goes like, oh, that was an account that kind of, used a similar password oh, wait a minute, why is my DNS registrar pointing to the wrong records? What's going on here? My account got compromised. Two-factor authentication is one of the tools that help put resistance against those sort of things. So you got to be mindful that you are a target, right? Because you know, that is an easy part of it. The other host compromise is get into the authoritative, you know, where you keep your zones. This is why, you know, the technique that is recommended out there is take your primary and your zone files, and if you're doing DNSSEC, your key infrastructure, and you stick that behind a secure area where essentially the only thing they talk to is the secondaries. And in the secondaries, you set up TSIG, which is encryption between them. So you set up access controls and you set up TSIG so you don't have the internet accessing them. But then that isn't the only thing, right? Because you can set up those protections, but remember, bad guys can get into the network. So there have been networks that I've been managing, and I'll be watching a state actor, and a state actor will do things like they'll get in, like some of the organizations who are battling this whole SolarWinds, you know, I would remind them, go check your key infrastructures, go check your build infrastructures, and go check your authoritative infrastructures on your zones. And they go like, huh? Says, oh yeah. So they got in this vector. The state actors will get in. The state actors, you know, are smart. Once they move in, they start moving around laterally. They start moving across your network, right? And as they move across laterally across the network, they'll do things like, oh, okay, let me go after the keys. Where are the encryption keys? Where's the build infrastructure? You know, when they build the software, where's the DNS authoritative? And it was, you know, 3 different organizations. I said, go look for these 3 things. And sure enough, 1, 2, 3. They went after authoritative infrastructure. They went after the key signing infrastructure for DNSSEC. Right? So just because you put the firewalls up doesn't mean the bad guys are not going to target those. So you have to protect that from inside and outside infrastructure. All right. So that's the aspect of that part of it. Then on the secondary infrastructure, you got to expect it to be attacked. Right? You can set up where they're you know, containers. You can set up different ways of doing it. You can work with cloud operators are probably the cheapest, most affordable out there, you know, to set up this resiliency on the DNS part of it. But you got to expect those things to be attacked. So if you only have secondaries inside the organization, you are going to be attacked. If you think you're just going to put the secondary on your ISP, that will get attacked, and the ISP may shut you down. So you want to spread these out across. And the easiest way today, you know, it used to be you'll go around and say, hey, different networks, and you go to a conference like Apricot, and you know, back in the early days of Apricot, one of the things that we would do at the peering part is says, hey, can I use one of your secondaries? And the internet volume was so low that, you know, we would trade. You know, I would be at Singtel and I would be having secondaries in 3 other networks in Asia Pacific, right? You know, that was normal. These days, that's not going to give you enough horsepower capacity, and you can't depend on it because somebody else in another network could say, oh, wait a minute, I can't take that DOS attack. I got to protect my customers. So this is something to think through with it on the secondary part. The other thing to look at is, you know, I see this over and over again. You know, you stick all the secondaries behind a router and stick it behind a firewall. You know, that's a trace route. You look up the name servers. You look at the secondaries. You do a trace route. Okay. That's easy, right? And the bad guys take advantage of that. The DDoS extortion attack, you know, because we were tracking, you know, Akamai, they had a lot of them. Every customer who had, or every organization who weren't yet a customer, if they had their DNS behind their data center with a firewall or a router protecting it, they got whacked. Just the extortion saw that, they traced route it, they mapped it out, whacked it. All right. So that's one of the things. It just doesn't work. And you know, you know, you'll hear this from many different people. You know, firewalls will say we will protect you. They don't. They are totally an important function for security inside your network, but a smart state actor today would take a stressor and do a state overload attack into a firewall, and then ramp up the state table, and then fill up the ASIC or the FPGA inside that chip, and then it will do its job. It will shut down. That's what it's supposed to do. So, you know, be mindful of this, of what they do on it, right? So, you know, they'll target everything around with the part of it. They'll also go out there and use infected malware to do these attacks, right? So this infected malware to watch out for is something that's going to be a tool we'll see more and more as I don't know if we have the camera on with this one, but you know, you just look at your cell phone. Bad guys are figured out many different ways to get access into, you know, the 4G and 5G networks, and I'll talk about that in a minute about the risk on those infrastructures with it, right? So the bad guys that go after this linkage between the DNS registrar and registry. So this is something that ICANN is seriously looking at. There's a protocol called EPP, which is the communication vehicle between the registrar and registry, and we've seen miscreants poking against that. All right, you know, so this is that, you know, if you're a authoritative zone, like if you're one of the national TLDs and you've got a registry and registrar function and you got EPP, don't take that for granted. That's an attackable element. It's a dependency to the entire DNS infrastructure, and the bad guys know that it exists and have been poking at it. So, you know, don't neglect that element of it. The IoT account compromise. So here's like a walkthrough of what could happen, right? Of like, you know, an IoT element of compromise, and you know why this works, right? So you got the bad guy. They want to go after and they want to redirect you. They want to go out there and load up a different software out there. So what they'll do is, because there's no DNSSEC validation, right? They will find where is the most easiest resolver to go out there to do a poison attack and to do a hijack with it, right? And they will either do the easy path. The easy path these days is actually breaking into the Wi-Fi element, right? And then changing the configuration, right? So that's probably the easiest path. Every now and then we'll get somebody who tries to do a poison attack against an older version of resolvers. A lot of resolvers they're hard to do these poison attacks. So whether it's on the caching resolver or on the proxy server, because there's no DNSSEC validation happening in those stages of the network, you know, right, they'll get poisoned, right? So you then once they get poisoned, they'll say, okay, I'm going to take and have the TV domain, and whenever the TV is doing a sync up for new software, I'm going to trigger it and say, here, load up new software. And the new software gets loaded up into the IoT device inside the home, and then the bad guy now has got access inside the home. Now, what I'm walking through right now is actually several cases that we've seen of this level of attack, where they went into the home router, they violated at that, and then from there they started using poison to actually have different devices and upload new images of IoT images inside the home, and then they're expanding the botnet capability with it. All that with DNS part, right? So this is another form of DNS attack vectors out there. So you kind of give an idea of these DNS risk factors. It's one of those sort of things that you have to kind of like think through, that there's a lot out there. And the intensity, and this is increasing over time, the intensity of such has started a couple of conversations out there. One conversation is around using DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS and DNS privacy. So we're going to talk about a bit about that, so you have understand the context around those and what vectors those protect. We're also got to worry about what's going on with 4G and 5G, because it's all merging together. 5G networks are going to be built differently from the 3G, 4G networks. And we'll talk about those factors out there. And then I'll briefly mention about what's going on in cloud elements with the core DNS elements that you have to also worry about. Okay, so you notice that the DNS is used everywhere. People are forgetting that need to pay attention to it. And the idea here is to really pay attention to it. All right, so
Barry,
DNS. Yep, go ahead.
I just interrupt for a second? The links that you published at the start of the session, where the presentation is and everything.
Oh, it's to the next presentation. So I shared the wrong one.
Oh, okay. Would you be able to repeat those links? A couple of people have asked,
Sure thing.
where they can find them. They've come in late.
Yep. Let me go grab those real quick.
Thanks, mate.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Copy here. Paste there. There we go. So that way everybody can follow along. And I'm up on slide number 33 is where I'm at right now. So let me go ahead and share this again. There we go. I see a whole bunch of animals have joined. Okay. So, and if other people have questions like that or things like that, just pop up in the Q&A or in the chat area, because we can stop at any time. This is a tutorial. This is informal, so we can actually help each other out. So DNS over HTTPS, DNS TLS, DNS privacy, right? It's kind of like this whole area of what they're trying to secure is between the stub and the resolver. Because remember I talked about a couple of those examples, like the IoT poisoned the home gateway to actually upload. In that case, one of the cases was to upload on DVRs, digital recorders, and they put new pieces of software and malware on those things. So one way to get around that is to take your stub, which is your computer, your phone, your PC, and encrypt DNS. And this is where DNS privacy is about. So what you're doing is a path between you and the resolver that does, DNS over HTTPS or DNS privacy, which is using the TLS, is to actually secure that path. Now, you'll lose out, right, in the sense of we have the proxy resolver for the Wi-Fi and the proxy resolver for your home gateway, or if this was in a corporate network, you'd have these different, forwarder elements. Sometimes they do caching, and you lose out some of the caching benefits. So there's the trade-off. You're trading off some cache hit sort of issues with security. Now, the reason why we can do that in the industry is, 20 years ago, cache hits on DNS made a huge difference because of the latency factors and where we had content. These days, with the way we push out, if I deploy a feature or a service on AWS and I push it out to like 6 AWS clouds in different parts of the world, it's pushed out to the edge. So the latency factor we were running into 20 years ago isn't so much of a factor today. So I can go through and say, okay, I'll trade off a latency hit on DNS, because at the beginning of the session, there's a diagram that shows that the latency of DNS, factors into the total connect time. So I'm going to trade off some latency for security, because there is a security risk there. So that's what I'm doing by making that choice with that. All right. So the trade-off with it, and the tests that we're doing in the industry on DoE is showing that it's customers are not complaining. Right. So this is one of the evolution paths, right, where it's either the DNS privacy path, using the TLS part, or the DoE. DoE is probably going to be the one that's going to be more so. Right now, the DNS over TLS, that's the element of it, right? So this is DOT. DOT is just using just a DOT element of it. Now, what you're going to see also is, you notice on here, this is the stub resolver to the cache. What you're going to see over the next couple of years is the resolver to the authoritative. Okay, and that's going to be a TLS element in there. All right. So these paths that kind of get attacked and violated are one thing, but one of the concerns that we're going to have is, as we move to like a resolver talking to an authoritative with TLS, that shifts everything from a load and a DOS resiliency factor, because today you build out your authoritative to handle UDP. Now, UDP is state load is different from handling TCP state load, which is different from handling HTTPS state load, let alone TLS state load, right? So you kind of get the aspect of what's going to be happening there, right? To gain this extra level of resiliency, we're going to have to solve a different resiliency factor, which is how do we handle things at a higher state load, right? So they don't come without things. So this is kind of like the factors of what's going on with the elements of it. Some operators, what they've been doing with the early deployments is they'll set up a device in front of the resolver. So they have the DOE talking to a device, and then that device then talks to the resolver. So like, for instance, Comcast, that's what they did for the early DOE deployments with it. So this is a deployable thing. This is something that if your organization isn't looking at, then you want to look at it. And I'll explain why you want to really look at it in just a moment, because on this section here, this is an old diagram. This is a 4G environment. How many people here knew that in 4G, you had 5 different DNS elements in the architecture? You know, I don't want to see you raise the hands here, but there's a lot of DNS inside of a 4G architecture. When you connect your cell phone and a big 4G network, right? That 4G network, when the cell phone connected, would do a connection to authorize that you get onto the network. It would talk to the MME. The MME would then talk to the APN DNS element. And the APN DNS element is a combination resolver and authoritative that have the APM function to point you to the S gateway and the P gateway. That's how your phone operated. And it also give you information over to the Roman. So if you wanted to call a different country, that was sent over to a DNS element, which is a separate authoritative zone. How we roam between cell phones. Like if I called somebody here from California and called somebody in Singapore, it would actually do a DNS query, right, to figure out the phone number I need to talk to into a GSM or a Roman a zone. Now you don't see those on the internet because it's a private zone infrastructure. That's DNS. We've seen people attack that. And then it didn't take off, but the original 4G architecture had this thing called IMS, and that had an authoritative infrastructure. Then, of course, to get out of your network, you had to go through a DNS resolver that's interconnected, but you also had all the DNS inside, all the elements inside of a 4G. Okay, so I give this illustration to show how DNS sneaks in all over the place. So if I do a 4G build out, I got DNS, which is the normal resolver for the internet. I got my authoritative infrastructure connected to the internet. I may have services connected to it. I got my Roman infrastructure. I got my internal infrastructure for like getting everywhere, so I can actually maintain my systems and do software updates and have all my my network management going on. And then I have the critical APN DNS function, right? So you can see how it slips in everywhere. And what's interesting around this, if you go to the 3GPP documents, they don't list it out this way, right? It's all, they rename it all. And then you lift up the stuff around the APM function and they renamed it all. And that happens quite often. So you'll see this in IoT architectures, DNS being snuck in and used because it works, right? It's a scalable working architecture that's very solid for namespace and for namespace to address space. So it's a functionality that works. So you see this snuck into it. You'll see this snuck in today in cloud infrastructure. So in cloud infrastructures, if I got a bunch of containers I fire up in my organization, and I got to do elasticity. So in other words, I got like X number of capacity and I'd expand to Y capacity. I fire up my containers. How do I tie everything together? You use core DNS or what used to be called Kubernetes DNS, right? So if you look up core DNS or Kubernetes DNS, you'll find this whole function of how do you actually do that elasticity. And you set that up where all that automatically registers and use TLS across with it, okay? And you know, I mentioned that to a lot of different people who are old-time DNSers, and they go like, I had no idea that's being used in you know, containers Kubernetes environment. Does it make sense? It works well. Now, if you try to tie that infrastructure to the public internet, now you got your security risk. And even within the Kubernetes environment, that's one of the elements you have to protect when you're doing the containers and Kubernetes environments, right? So you kind of see this, you know, security wake-up call, right? It's critical to everybody with it. I mentioned before about all the different attacks with it, right? So we'll see more and more of them out there, right? So one of the big security wake up calls was when the sea turtle attacks happened, people go like, wow, that's a nifty stuff. This is the attack where they violated the credentials, right? And once they violated the credentials, they went in and changed things in the registrar, registered things with the let's encrypt, right? And then when everybody was using it, they kind of rerouted everybody across, right? So one of the things that we saw with that was, two particular items that critical to everybody today. And I mentioned this to everybody. Besides boosting up your DNS authoritative infrastructure, is protect your domain name. You protect your domain name by making sure, and we'll walk through a checklist of different things here in a moment of making sure that your access to your registrar is as secure it needs to be, and your management of your domain names is secure, right? And the other thing is, if you haven't done it yet, emphasize over and over again, turn your DNS resolver into a security tool. Just some people say that the transition to doing DNS over HTTPS, DO, where I have encryption to my DO, is going to stop this functionality. It's not, because you just work with a resolver that checks all your DNS queries against badness, and it protects yourself. So for over many different almost 2 decades, this technique is one of the most effective security techniques in protecting the organizations, right? So those sort of things, and you can turn it into services, Open DNS, Quad 9, Quad 1, all these different services out there that you can do with this. So it's easier and easier to do, but do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump out here in a minute on this particular post, and I'll share the link with everybody with it too. Let me just capture this link. I'll drop this in so everybody can look at it here. So this is an article when the sea turtle thing came out, and I started talking to different customers and talking to people in the industry about, we're attacking against a registrar. People say, oh, use the ICANN advice. And honestly, I haven't looked at the ICANN security guidelines in a while. And I started looking at ICANN security guidelines and go like, this is so freaking confusing. It's a bureaucratic document. And so what happened is we grabbed a whole bunch of DNS gurus together, and we built this checklist, this kind of like guide. And I'm just going to jump out of this for a minute. Let me shut down the presentation mode here. And then I'll share this here. There we go. So this is kind of like the blog article with it. It kind of it's assigned to have a normal DNS administrator and walk them through. Here's the things you need to do. Like here's the risk to it. Here's the audit exercise to check. Like I'd be surprised. I mean, today I was talking to one organization, and they're trying to figure out what to do with DNSSEC deployment, and we're saying, okay, which registrars to use, and they're going like, okay, we got a problem there. If you don't know what registers you have and what passwords you have to it and how you're protecting it and how you set it for roles and responsibilities, then that's how the sea turtle attack and those things work with it. Because why go after your authoritative infrastructure and break into the key structure where you could just grab somebody's passwords, right? That's the threat vector here. And that's what this is about with it. And it kind of talks through the things that you need to look at. Like what happens when the DNS administrator, who everybody neglects and ignores, and they leave. And then they look around and says, okay, wait a minute, who had the passwords? Oh, that guy did. Oh, but he left 6 months ago. Okay, whoops. That's happened, right? That's the sort of stuff of we walk through with this. So when you look at this checklist with it, it's talking through, pretty basic stuff. Review access, to your registrars. Who has what roles and responsibilities? Document them. Think through the employee transitions, like what happens when people move or people get promoted, right? Because they move around inside the company, right? How you're going to update all the registration information, like when you go through updates and things like that, right? The role-based registration is a recommended thing because ask your registrar, it says, can I set up a role-based? Now, a role-based would be that instead of Barry Green having access to the registrar, I have DNS admin have access to the registrar. And then inside the organization, you have a safe piece of paper locked up in a safe. Here is DNS admin, and here's access instructions for DNS admin. So that way you're not dependent on one person, right? So you don't use personal email addresses, because when you use personal email addresses like that, they're targetable. They're targeted by what? Phishing attacks, right? So they're targeted by somebody trying to break into your computer to get access to it, right? So this makes it where it's harder to target. Remember the principles of the miscreants. All these sort of techniques here are trying to make it harder for somebody to go after you, right? You want to protect against phishing attacks. Make sure that your sysadmins are not like bypassing your phishing protection techniques, right? Whatever ones you use. Go, do the credential changes. Say, okay, everybody, enforce it. Be really strict. The basics do work. Forcing everybody to change your password out at a periodic time, is important. I mean, a big company like here at Akamai, even though we use two-factor authentication and zero trust, I have to change my passwords. It's just part of what we need to do to keep, our customers and our organization safe. So we, even though we do the newer things of like zero trust, we're still doing the basic things, right? And those sort of factors. Talk to your registrar and make sure you're doing two-factor authentication, and then understand what their security policies are. The next section after this is having meaningful security conversations with your vendors. Your registrar is a vendor. What are your security policies? And if you're working with a registrar and they don't know what the security policies are of the organization, then okay, maybe I need to shift my registrar, right? Review their privacy registration stuff and how they're maintaining the work, all right? So these are all the different factors out there, look through it. And as I mentioned on this, go back to this document here, we got it kind of like, listed out. You can print this out, you can use this, you can cut and paste it. It's all designed around this. And this is basically what we did with this one is we used our decade, a whole bunch of us with decades of experience in maintaining zones and DNS. And then we referred to like, the NIST guidelines and the ICANN guidelines, right? So this is not like a bunch of people just saying, here's what to do. It's just like this is basically digesting these guidelines in a simpler way of doing it so that you as a sysadmin who's forgotten about inside your organization can kind of go through and say, okay, here's what I need to do to make sure that sea turtles sort of, targeted against those registrars don't hit me, right? So that's the idea. Like for instance, do you lock your domains? So what registrar lock is, between the registrar and the registry, you can actually lock the transaction, right? So they'd stay that way. And then you have to do a special procedure to unlock it, right? So that way you can't have anybody who actually bypassed it, every single technique that got in and then change it. Or broke into the registrar, because registrars also get attacked. So they break into the registrar and you have registry lock on that, then all of a sudden all these warnings go off, right? If somebody tries to change it and they haven't passed the right key and doing the registrar lock, right? So these are guidelines around that. Okay, so let me pop back to this one. So now let's talk about DNSSEC. Some people say, oh, just do DNSSEC. Now, DNSSEC, let's walk through it. The root gets signed. Good. All right. The top-level domains get signed. Good. All right. Chain of trust. Then I sign my authoritative server. All right. Good. All right. Got that set up. And then somebody out there or a TV set or IoT device, they use a Wi-Fi home router or a DNS resolver, and they don't turn on DNSSEC validation. Nothing's happened. Nobody's using it. This is the core reason why people question DNSSEC. So for the long history of DNSSEC, remember, there's I mentioned at the beginning of it, the DNS Resolver Infrastructure, the cache and resolver, the proxy resolvers, the sub resolvers, you know, that's one type of DNS. Authoritative is a different type of DNS, right? There isn't one DNS. There's, you know, how you resolve, how you set up the authoritative zones, different architectures. Because the resolver side was too expensive, too much cache load, longer delays, and things like that. It just didn't make sense for an operator says, I don't see the benefit to me as an ISP to turn on DNSSEC validation on my DNS resolvers. None of my customers are complaining, because example.com, who did the sign-in, they're not paying me. My customers who are getting internet access to me are paying me, and they're not complaining. So I'm not going to turn it on. Now that's changed. So it's changed because two factors. Number one, the DNS resolver software out there is better, right? The software that the resolver, that the ISP has available is much better software. There's less of a load on doing DNSSEC validation. So the software is better. Two, the internet's pushed out to the edge, right? So we don't have the latency hit from the edge. Three, people are more concerned about security, right? If I'm going to do DNS over HTTPS to secure the path between my stub and my resolver and not do DNSSEC, wait a minute, right? So what we're seeing is a increased realization that DNSSEC actually now has some functionality to it. Now it actually is worth it, because when you go out there and you look, and APNIC Labs did some of the tests with it. I think I'll plug this into this slide deck. So when you look at this slide deck, this link, I'll probably add some slides in there to the APNIC Labs. I'll put a little module at the end of it. So a version you'll see tomorrow, just come back to these slides. I'll put the link to the APNIC Labs, because they did a good study about how many of resolvers out there have it, right? So, and then Vincent asks here, can attackers utilize DNSSEC packet as a form of DOS attack, like doing the DNS amplification? Feasible, because it's an extra lookup, but it's given the pointers, because basically what you're doing with DNSSEC on the resolution is you're saying, can I trust you? So it's not an encrypted like state. It's just giving a request and saying like, can I trust you? Can I trust you? Can I trust you? And here's a key. Okay, that key works. Here's a key. That key works, right? So it's basically a trusted path. So it's lighter weight than like a TLS negotiation. So a TLS negotiation you're doing is more heavyweight than a DNSSEC one. So it's something you have to be mindful of. You have to plan for. What if somebody whacked me with a whole bunch of DNSSEC requests? So like, for instance, one of the resiliency elements I use in inside Akamai for our authoritative infrastructures is I'll have a DNSSEC factor. Like if somebody sent tons and tons and tons of DNSSEC requests against my infrastructure, then here's the load I can expect, and then we do a capacity model to make sure we can handle that. So that's a good question, Vincent. So so could happen with that. So DNSSEC in the past, you know, people have been saying to do it, but this is the reason why. But what's been changing is now people are seeing that, hey, it's working. Better software, the internet's been moving to the edge, and the DOE requirements is actually pushing where it's actually working out better. So that's the factors around that. Yes, go ahead.
Yep, I'm mindful that we're out of time. One of the attendees has asked if you can republish the link for the first presentation today. Perhaps we can start off the third presentation with you giving everybody the links that you've done for today.
Oh yeah, can do.
So people
are looking for the So let me
the first
quickly...
first one this afternoon.
Yeah. And I was just finishing up on this one, so this is actually quite good. So this is kind of the last slide with it. So on this one here, here's a bunch of links you'll find in this one. So there's a and there
you're a popular man.
There we go. Well, people go like, I can grab Barry's slides. and not have to do it, and then change it to where it's my slides and present to my boss and look good. You know, that's the stuff we want to do. So this is the other one, and I'll drop this so everybody here gets a copy. This is the first one, and then in the next session we'll publish all these so you get the next crew can see it too. So so thanks everyone, you know, for attending. As I mentioned, I'll probably add at the end of this here, there's some good APNIC labs, since we're in the APNIC region. I'm a big fan of APNIC labs. You know, Jeff, Joel, and George are, I love hearing them talk. I love hearing their research, and they did some good work on the DNSSEC validation that it's also shown. It's something to consider. Okay, good. And I think we're finished up here for this one.
All right, that's good. Thanks, Barry. Just from reminder to everybody, you'll need a new link for the next one, which starts in 45 minutes. So go to the schedule and grab your link, and we will see you here at 2 p.m. Manila time, 4 p.m. Brisbane time. Thanks very much.
And we'll have some extra, I'll make sure we have extra time on that one so people can ask questions on any of the sessions, you know, so we'll have all the links there. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you.